But it's certainly to see how complex the assembly of the Holy Bible as we know it today, how that whole process went down, argues to me against this whole notion of just one very clear, divinely inspired truth. It certainly argues against revelation, and argues for a very human, very political movement.
Yeah.
And so
it almost seems self-evident,
because God could have just made it clear. Right? I mean, why do you need to just spend 200 years debating something? They're sort of like, God, what do you want in here, what not? Right? I mean, if this God wanted a New Testament and he wanted it to be his divinely inspired word to reach the rest of the human race, you think that he could have just, come up with, another set of tablets, right, from Mount Sinai?
He needs like an advertising campaign, because clearly we're not doing a good job down here. So that's what he needs,
Yeah, something like that. So, yeah, it's history of the church does interest me, but it's an entirely separate subject than atheism versus theism debates, I think. But equally interesting and worthwhile.
Yeah, I'm starting to get more and more into that end of it. Like when I first decided to do this show, I pretty much dove into the arguments, and I was like, okay, this is probably what's going to happen. And I was thinking, well, where is all this coming from? What was this built upon? And I think that's just as important as the argument itself, because it shows you the context in which it took place, right? So, let's see. Here's a fun question for you. Let's see. What's the most agitating either type of call you get on the Atheist Experience, or the most agitating call you remember?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, immediately discounting just the trolls, and the people who call in to just shout profanities or death threats. Yeah. We don't really get that quite so much anymore. We get it on occasion in the past. We had a guy years back, before I was the regular host, and I was regular host from like 02 to 04, and then before that, Jeff D was regular host. I was the co-host, and that was from like 01. No, it was like from 2000 to 02. Okay. And we used to do it where it was just a host and a co-host, and it was the two regular guys on every week. I think it's much better the way we do it now. But we would have a guy who would call the show every week, Steve the Creationist, right?
Oh.
And he was a weekly guy who called, and we got a lot more. We're getting more Christian callers now, but for a while we got actually, when we were only on Access, local Austin Access, and we did not have the international presence via the web. Well, then most of the people who saw the show were, folks who were just channels in their cable, right, and cable device, like the hell is this, right? So we had weekly a guy, Steve the Creationist, and he would advance just the dumbest, right? I mean, it's the Paluxy Man tracks, that kind of thing, right? I mean, he would just whatever, and he was exceedingly dishonest, and this was exasperating to us because he would do the usual hit and run thing, right? Like he would talk about he'd call up the show and have one thing he wanted to hit us with, right? Mm-hmm. And we'd either argue with him right then and there, or like if he brought up something that we didn't really know a whole lot about at the time, we'd go research it during the week, and then we'd come back on next week's show and we would answer it. And then he'd call back, and he'd have a whole different thing that he wanted to talk about, right? Without even acknowledging, without at least having the integrity and the honesty to acknowledge, okay, yes, you addressed my point. He could have said, okay, I don't agree with your address. He could have said that, sure, nothing's done. But he didn't even have that level of integrity, right? He'd bring up a creationist argument, we would refute it, and then instead of going, okay, guys, you refuted me, or continuing the argument, trying to, offer a real, he'd go on to a whole other topic, and that just got us really angry at a certain point.
Right.
To where we said, Steve, if you want to call in today, like we did this at the beginning of the show, I can remember one show Russell was on, sometimes we had, and he would say, look, Steve, if you're going to call in today, we are not going to take your call unless we expect you to acknowledge that we have addressed this question you raised and we have responded to it. I mean, if when we take your call, we expect you to do that. If you don't do that and you immediately want to jump into some other topic, we're going to hang up on you. and we're going to, and I think that day he actually didn't call.
No.
And then he would call again. And I think it finally got to the point where he was calling every week simply because he knew that he would piss off Jeff, right? So, so I think that exasperated me because he knew that he could get, Jeff is wonderful, right? And I learned a lot about arguing from Jeff, and I love his, sucker punch style, right?
Yeah.
But he's a guy that, Christians he would rise to the bait more than I would like, than I wished he would. And I sometimes would tell him that. It's like, you let him piss you off too easily. And I think Steve just began calling every single week simply because he, watch me piss this guy off, right? That's what it was all about. It descended to simple trolling at that point. When Jeff left the show and I moved over into the host chair, Steve kept calling for a while, but then he quit. And I think he quit calling simply because Jeff wasn't on. He would ask me something, I'd answer him, say what else you got, and I would never, I wouldn't quite explode like Jeff would do.
Yeah.
And I think that so I think I think I disappointed him. I was,
Yeah.
But,
everybody's got kind of different personality on your show. Like, I mean, Matt's kind of.
That's why I think the show's better now that we have the rotating co-hosts and there's like 6 of us.
Yeah, because there's you, Jeff, Matt, Tracy, Jen, Dawn, Russell, Jeff.
Yep.
Is that all of them?
Yeah, I think it was 2. Okay, Matt, Jeff, Russell, Tracy, Jen, Don, myself. So there's 7.
Okay.
7.
I thought you were going to say Ed for a second. Remember that guy Ed that phoned in a few times? Or
Ed.
Was his name not Ed because he kept changing it or something like that, and then you guys called him on it? And then you said, "Hey, didn't you just call in?" He's like, "Oh, yeah, I lied. That's not."
We had a few of those. It's not really been one person. You know who used to call us up on and use an assumed name and think we wouldn't catch him?
Who's that?
Alex Jones.
Really?
You know who he is, right? The right-wing conspiracy theory guy. He's maybe up in Canada. He's not as well known.
I don't know
as he is down here, but he's grown to serious national, maybe international prominence. Because he was Glenn Beck down here before there was Glenn Beck, with his wild conspiracy, Illuminati. The UN is going to take over our minds with death rays and whatever. He's exactly one of those guys, and now and it's funny, right? I mean, he doesn't work because I think he got inheritance. So this is all he does, right? He's had the luxury of living his own life, his entire life inside his own head. And like a lot of the conspiracy theory types, right? He's big on getting high on his own supply, and he just spreads that, like a pusher, right? I mean, most pushers know better than to do that, but he does it and then he spreads it, and so he's become a really big, and he's very, very well known internationally now, just in that community, in the paranoid conspiracy theory bunch. Yeah. And so, but even back then he was fairly notorious. But he would call our show and pretend to be someone else. And then we go, Alex, dude, this is Alex, right? And we'd be like, you have your own show for this stuff, do you? I remember he called up one time, because he's not really simpatico with us, I wouldn't think, right? I mean, he's this right-wing, libertarian, Glenn Becky dude, so I don't know what his own personal religious... I suspect that they would be very flexible depending on what audience he wanted to reach. But he called us up one time and was ranting on about shit, I forget. The UN is trying to force everyone to join a green religion. That's what it was all about. Didn't make much sense, but it was funny. And we were finally like, this is Alex Jones, isn't it? Like, dude, you got your own show for this crap, please.
Sorry, Martin, one sec. Don't call Skype yet. Somebody's trying to get through. Me and Martin are still talking.
Well, I mean, if you want to talk, if we want to take some live calls, I'm happy to do that.
I just got a message, so I don't know if he's doing that or I don't even really know how Skype works, to tell you the truth. I just know how to take calls. Okay, he's gone. But no, okay. As soon as we're done with the interview, I'm going to stay for an extra half an hour afterwards. Everybody can call on. It's good with me.
I have forgotten, I'm sorry,